talking about Jacob today. We're looking at around 2000 BC here, and Jacob is on the scene. There was Abraham and his son Isaac, and now we get to Jacob. And Jacob's life began with a lot of junk and drama, and he had a lot going on even early. He was the younger twin that was born to Isaac. And when you're the younger twin in general, I don't think you ever stop hearing that you're the younger twin. We have a few sets of twins actually in here right now, I know, and one set of twins I've got to know over the last year and a half or so. And I remember asking, like, which one of you is the oldest? I guess that's what weird strangers do when they don't know what to talk about, So I was talking to these young girls. I think they were in elementary school at the time, said, which one of you is older? And of course, the older twin raised her hand and she said, it's me. And she said, and those were the best moments of my life. So those moments before the second one, like that's freedom. And then it's kind of downhill from there. And that was the existence for Jacob's older brother, Esau. He's born, everything's great. And then literally on his heels, holding on to his heel, was Jacob, the younger brother. His name is a little bit synonymous with deceiver, and he certainly lived that out. He was a guy that was not necessarily the most character-filled, integrity-filled guy along the way. So he lived up to that name in many ways. But before it was over, he had fallen out of favor with his older brother. He had fallen out of favor with his father. He had fallen out of favor with one of his wives, and that's another part of the story that we'll read through. He had fallen out of favor with his in-laws, but who doesn't? He had fallen out of favor with a lot of people in his life along the way. And at the point in the story that we're going to pick up on today, at this point in the story, he is a tired man. He spent his entire life trying to somehow reach, experience, fulfill that potential as this legacy of Abraham, as this one who was obviously the heir to a promise. And he had worked and worked to get there. He had amassed a lot of stuff. He had a lot of money. And on the outside, everything seemed to have gone perfectly for him, but there was still a void in his life, and there was still something he was desperately missing. And he couldn't quite figure out what it was. And in Genesis chapter 32, he's on the move again, but this time he's actually going to the home of his family. He's actually going home for the first time since he ran out of the house. He's returning home, but he's not going home alone. He has all his stuff. He's got all his livestock. He has all his servants. He's got his wives. He's got his family. He's got so much stuff. He's going home. It's like a parade, a caravan of stuff. It's going home. And he's, for the first time, going to be reunited with his older brother. And I don't know, but I would imagine that those closest to him got the feeling like something's up. Like there's something off, there's something different about Jacob at this point. And I assume that they assumed that it had something to do with the fact that he's going to see his brother for the first time since his brother said, I'm going to kill you, so help me God. And that was the last thing he ever heard. So now he's coming back. His older brother is still there, and this will be the face-to-face. So if for no other reason than that, it's understandable that he would be a little apprehensive. He was never really the one that was aggressive anyway. That was the older brother who was much more like his father. We're told that Jacob was much more like his mom, which is not a bad thing, but that was in many ways one of the struggles with his dad and him. He never really could connect the way his older brother could. So he's going back to see him for the very first time. He sets up camp. This is the last night they're going to camp before they make the rest of the trip home. He sets up camp for everyone else, and then he chooses to go across the stream and put a tent by himself there on the other side of the stream where he is going to spend the night. Now, we don't know exactly if this was his practice along the way. It seems to be that it wasn't. It's pointed out in the story in Genesis 32, so it seems to be a little different. Perhaps he had his own tent all the while, but he goes across the stream, he has a tent for himself, and he spends the night. And in Genesis chapter 32, verse 24, this is what went down inside the tent. It says, Jacob was alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it's daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And the man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." So a lot goes down from sundown to sunup inside that tent. We know there was a fight. We know something weird happened there. We know that it was more than just a guy broke in a tent to rob him and they fought. Because in the end, Jacob names that place Peniel because he realized this was not just a man. He had seen someone from God, and face to face with God, he said, I'm going to name it that. So we're going to get into maybe what was going on there in a moment. But I want us to understand that Jacob was born to be great, and he knew that. Not in an arrogant, prideful way, but he knew that God had specifically put him in his story for a reason. His grandfather Abraham, his father Isaac, he being Jacob, he's at that spot now where he realizes he is carrying a torch that is bigger than anything that he ever thought he would carry. In spite of everything that's happened, he was born to be great, but he was not living like a man that was born to be great. He wasn't living like a man who was the child and the heir of a promise. He wasn't living like a man who would one day be the father of the namesake for all the 12 tribes of Israel. He was living like a man who had a lot of stuff on the outside, but on the inside was missing something vital. On the outside, everyone would have said, he is one blessed dude. Like, that guy has got some stuff. And on the inside, Jacob was very much tormented. And there's a lot to learn from his life. But I'm going to focus on one critical truth for him this morning. It's that God tends to open doors for those who have met with him behind closed doors. For Jacob and for everyone else who has lived over the last 4,000 years since then, God tends to open doors for those who have taken the time to meet with him behind closed doors. God had given, in many ways, Jacob a lot of stuff, but it wasn't until this moment when he met with God behind closed doors that things truly changed for him. And his life was actually never the same. When we talk about God's blessing, we usually envision someone like Jacob, someone who has stuff, someone who just can't stop making money and can't stop having influence. And yet we can project an image on the outside of being blessed, but there is a difference between having stuff and being blessed. There's a difference between experiencing good things and having God's favor in our lives. And Jacob was at a point where he had a lot of gifts, but he knew that he did not have the blessing of God on him. And that was not going to happen until he met behind closed doors with God. You can't fake favor, and Jacob knew that. So no matter what everyone else thought, Jacob knew there was still something missing. And the key to God blessing the things on the outside is accepting what he wants to do on the inside. And I know none of us aspires to be the father of a nation or be the namesake of a country. That we get that. But all of us at some point will realize there is a difference between being helpful, being good, being kind, and being a man of God. Those are two different things. You can be helpful and you can be kind and you can be rich and you can be influential and you can still miss out. Now, there's nothing wrong with those other things, but it has to start on the inside and work out. And Jacob got that. And behind closed doors was where it was going to happen. So how do we fight for God's favor in our lives? If that's what we actually want, if we want to know God's hand of favor is on our relationships, on our reputation, on our finances, on our lives, on our homes, on our families, if we're going to experience that, how do we fight for that? Jacob had this moment where he's in this tent and he's wrestling with the guy. I don't know that that's going to happen for us. So how do we look at this fight as something that is attainable for us? Well, I want to give you a few words of encouragement here as we think through this. Number one, to find God's favor in our lives, we are going to first have to overcome the fear of being alone with God. There is a fear of being alone with God that is more common than you think. And truth be told, most of us look for God in the spectacular, not in the secret. Like, we want to see God work and move in big ways. And Sundays is one of those moments. I mean, it's pretty exciting to be a part of something that you know is alive and breathing and growing. And I love being a part of this. I love knowing every single week I'm going to have a conversation with someone who says, I'm not yet a follower of Jesus, but today I took a step. I've been praying for that and praying for that and praying for that, and I'm seeing it here. I know that every couple of weeks, at least, I'm going to be able to be surrounded by a group of people who are stepping into the baptism waters and going public with their faith. I know that every week I'm going to look up and have someone say, hey, my friend's here today. This is the first time. This is a big day. Don't mess up. I know I'm going to have those moments along the way. I love that. I love that pressure because it means God's up to something around us. But in the end, if this is all I do and I never take the time to overcome the fear of being alone, I'm going to continually miss out. Because over and over in God's story, you're going to find that there are people who were looking for God in the spectacular, and he shows up in the secret moments. You don't really have to do anything to show up here and leave and like, okay, I have a choice now. I can either say that message was great or the sermon doesn't apply to me. I can say, yeah, I like the music today, or they didn't do the songs that I like. I could come in saying, yeah, I was greeted or I wasn't greeted. I can come saying the coffee was good or the coffee was bad. There's nothing we're investing. But overcoming that fear of being alone, that's next level stuff. One of the greatest things some of you moms and dads can do for your family is to be willing to get up 30 minutes early, go by yourself on the other side of the house, get on your face, put your hands on the couch, put your knees on the floor, and just beg for God to show up and meet with you. Say, well, that seems really weird and that's kind of odd. I didn't say it was easy. I didn't say it costs nothing. There's a lot of work there. But you and I have got to be willing, and I understand it. Those things are challenging. But there have been so many moments when I've stopped and I've just gotten alone and said, God, I don't know what I want you to do. I just know I need you. I don't know what to say. I'm here, and I need to meet with you. And I don't know if you're going to speak to me or if I'm just going to read your word here and those will be your words for the day. I don't know, but I know that I need you enough to carve out that time and being alone with you. But we fear because what's God going to ask me to do? What am I going to read? What weird thing is he going to tell me to let go of? What am I going to have to stop? I don't want to have to deal with this. I haven't seen God face to face since I did that thing, and this is going to be really, really awkward. And there are so many reasons not to, but Jacob understood that for anything to move forward, he was going to have to overcome that fear. Now, before we get to the next word of encouragement here, I guess the question is, who was that guy? Like, who was in the tent? Now, if you've worked through the story of God with us already, you know a few weeks ago, we took a look at this very weird moment in which some things that God made, heavenly beings, not human, not gods, but heavenly beings, intersected with the lives of human beings, and there was this weird offspring produced that we call the Nephilim, and it's a lot. We're not going to get into it now. It was a Buc-ee's moment but inside joke if you were here a few weeks ago. But it's a very weird thing, but people show up. You've got these visitors that show up with Abraham, visitors from God who came and sat and ate with him, gave him a message, and then went down to deliver God's judgment to Sodom and Gomorrah. Who were they? They were more than humans. They weren't, it wasn't an angel thing, flapping wings. There were people there. And it appears that one of these heavenly beings God sent as a messenger to Jacob, met with them there, and there was a full-on fight happening. I think the first time that I read through this as a kid, I just assumed it's like when you have a dream and you wake up and you're punching the air, you're kicking, you're riding your bike and your feet are going. And I just envisioned Jacob lying there on his back, just beating the air like it was all a dream and a vision. And yet as you continue reading on, you realize like that doesn't happen in a dream. You don't get a black eye in a dream when you're fighting air. Like something was going on here. So there's a battle taking place. Being alone with God was going to be a very intimidating, frightening, and confusing experience, but Jacob embraced it. Number two, find the fighter that God made you to be. Within every single one of us, there is a will to fight that God has placed within us. Now, I understand living in this part of the world that we're often guilty of turning everything into a war. And we have John Wayne Jesus that, we kind of envision. I know that. It's a struggle. But there is a fight within all of us that we have to be willing to step up to. And some of you need to stop quitting and start fighting. Because most of us, every time something gets hard, if there is not a visible, tangible, usually financial reward, we just don't step into it. It just gets too much when we back away. It's not that we don't want it. We just don't want it badly enough to fight for it. And I love the picture here, this image of Jacob holding on to this man of God. And the man of God literally says, let go, like just get off me. And yet Jacob will not. He's holding on to this man of God. He's getting beaten up and down. He's holding on to the point where his hip is dislocated and he refuses to let go. And I have to ask myself at times, I want to be this, but how badly do I want this? I want this for my church family, but how badly do I want this? Because at some point, these things come with a cost. And every single one of us at some point has made a promise and we just didn't step up. We volunteered for something and then we just kind of backed away. We said we'll commit to that, then we just gave a half-hearted commitment and then we were gone. We've all done that. And there are times when I've sat where you've sat and someone has stood here and they've shared something like this and I've clearly sense God saying, Chad, you know what's next for you. And I'm like, I'm all in. I'm doing this. And I get to the parking lot, I get in the car, and before I'm even home, I'm already looking for ways to undo what just happened. It's happened before to me, and I'm sure it's happened to many of you. And at some point, we have to find the fighter within us. We have to find that fight to step up and say, God, I know what this is going to cost. I know this is going to ultimately be a difficult challenge, but I'm all in. And I'm willing to fight for this thing. And you can count on me. Find the fighter within you that God's called you to be. And then the third thing is to accept the change that God wants to make inside of you. If I can meet with God one-on-one, I can get sweaty and I can get beaten up and I can do all of that. But if in the end I'm not willing to accept whatever it is that God's laid before me, then nothing is going to take place. Nothing is going to be different. At times I have to look myself in the mirror and ask myself the same question. I've gone back to it for years and years now. When God reveals a correction that needs to take place in my life, how quickly do I respond? And if you have a child or if you've ever babysat a little kid, there's a difference between saying, go do that, and a child responding and then go do that and then I'll get to it, or just giving you a look or just waiting or okay and then nothing. There's nothing more frustrating than that. And there's nothing more frustrating, I believe, than when God looks down at me and says, Chad, that has to be different in your life. If you want to be this man of God that I've called you to be, if you want to be this husband that you say you want to be, then that has to change. And then God just looks at me like, now. You're not going to wait here. Your response time tells me everything I need to know about your heart. Now, that's a God-me thing. Maybe you never struggle with that. Maybe all of you are yes, sir, no, sir, I'm out. Maybe. But I know for me, I at times have to check myself and look at my response time and realize that that's how God actually knows how serious I am about being the person I say that I want to be. So accept the change that God wants to make. The change Jacob literally experienced was having a new name. He comes out of the tent the next morning. His wife says, good morning, Jacob. Nope, call me Israel. What? That had to be a weird conversation. I'm sorry. But I'll explain later. It was a long night. So he has this name change. We even see later in a moment here that he has a physical change that took place. He was never the same after this night. This night changed everything. And we have in the morning in verse 31, it says, the sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon. So this is a legend at this point. I mean, everyone knows this, that for the rest of Jacob's life, he limped, which is really odd because we think when I finally have that moment where God does his work, and as far as my faith is concerned, he heals me, that everything's going to be better. But you've got a man full of money, full of respect, full of people in his life, full of everything, and full of health. He goes into his tent. He meets God. He walks out with a black eye and a dislocated hip and a new name, and he's never the same. Like, which Jacob do we want? Like, I think there's a debate. Most of us would like the other way. Most of us would say, forget the tent business. Let's just go back to where we had plenty of stuff, plenty of money, plenty of this, plenty of that. I've survived this long. Jacob's not a bad name. I mean, I'll just stick with that. And yet, what made the difference for him was that night and that experience. And so I want to close reminding you that sometimes the sign of God's favor is a scar. Most of the time, when we view what God wants to do in our lives, we assume that the sign of God's favor is healing. The sign of God's favor is that we could walk better, that we could walk faster, that we could do more. And yet, sometimes throughout God's story, the sign of favor is the scar. He limped the rest of his life as a public way of reminding people of a private encounter he had with God, in which God sealed him, put a new name on him, and said, now you have my favor. Now you're blessed. You can't walk, but you're blessed. You've got to explain some weird stuff to your wife, but you're blessed. Like, you have a lot to talk about, but you're blessed. And God went with him, and ultimately we know him now as Israel, his sons, the 12 sons, the tribes of Israel, for the most part, named after his sons. There's a couple names, but that's a different story for Joseph's time. But for the most part, his name forever will be known, the name Israel. But he had to go through this to get there. And if you are going to be the men and women of God that all of you want to be, you're going to have to go through some stuff. And some of those stuffs, what am I doing? Come on. I need to go back to school this semester. Some of those things are going to be very, very difficult and incredibly challenging for us. When we look at our life story and we look at struggles we go through and hard things, a lot of times we associate those with, we've done something bad, therefore God is doing this to us. We've messed up, therefore this is God's way of reconciling that. There are some times when we just go through some stuff because God has a story to write with you in it. And you're not going to be able to be that person prepared for that next chapter, that next part of the story, unless you go through that. And some of those losses and some of those heartaches and some of those moments of pain, some of those moments of doubt, some of those moments of question are going to be the moments that you look back on one day and realize that's what made me who I am. That is what God used. I would love to look back and say there was a time when that one man shook my hand and said, you're doing a great job, and that changed my life. But that's probably not going to be the story I look back on. I love to be able to look at some moments and say, I can't believe I had the privilege of being able to do this. And that was the moment that changed my life. I'm most likely going to look back on my life story and say, this moment that I thought was the end of all things turned out to be the moment that God used to shape and mold me into the person that I actually always prayed that he would. I just didn't know that this was going to be a part of it. I didn't know that this was going to be a part of that story. And you may go through the same stuff. That thing that you want to forget more than anything else you've ever experienced may end up being the one night that God uses to set you on the path to being the person God created you to be.